On May the 5th, 1980, something happened in London that would become one of the most studied moments in hostage rescue history. An Iranian embassy was under siege. Inside, armed hostage-takers held dozens of people. The situation had deteriorated to its final hour. An ultimatum was issued: execute hostages or surrender. And in that moment of absolute pressure, a British SAS commander made a decision that would define the entire operation. He gave his team exactly 40 seconds to breach and neutralize the threat. What happened in those 40 seconds became the textbook model for tactical hostage rescue, a decision made under impossible time pressure and a case study in command under fire. The world didn't know the full weight of what was about to unfold. The media circus outside the embassy had built to fever pitch. Negotiators had been talking for days. The siege had begun on April the 30th when 6 armed members of the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan, or DRFLA, stormed the Iranian embassy in Prince's Gate, South Kensington, a prestigious address in the heart of London's West London diplomatic quarter. The location itself added psychological weight to the operation. This wasn't some isolated compound in a distant location. This was central London, one of the world's most carefully guarded and monitored cities. The presence of an active siege in such a prominent location created immense pressure on British authorities and on international observers. They had taken approximately 26 hostages, though accounts vary slightly on the exact number throughout the siege. The group included diplomats, embassy staff, and a police officer who had been overpowered trying to prevent the initial takeover. The gunmen had demands. They wanted the regime in Iran to release political prisoners. They wanted negotiations. They wanted a platform, and they wanted safe passage out of the country. The demands were not unreasonable by the standards of hostage-takers, but they were also impossible for British authorities to grant unilaterally. Britain could not order the Iranian government to release prisoners. Britain could not guarantee safe passage out of the country while wanted for murder. The gunmen's demands were therefore designed to be both substantial enough to be taken seriously and fundamentally unachievable, creating a situation where the negotiation process would eventually break down. British authorities had been trying to negotiate them out of the building since the moment the siege began, managing the situation minute by minute, hoping that time and careful dialogue would lead to a peaceful resolution. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button to not miss any story. And check out our Patreon in the description. We post full, uncensored stories there. Every graphic detail, every brutal moment, nothing redacted. Stories YouTube won't allow. Now let's get into it. For 5 days, negotiators had been working the phones, playing for time, trying to build rapport with the gunmen inside. The negotiation process was methodical. Police negotiators, specifically trained in crisis communication, would establish telephone contact with the gunmen, attempt to understand their motivations, build rapport, and gradually work toward reducing their demands or convincing them to surrender. In this case, the negotiators had made some progress. The gunmen had extended deadlines twice already. They had agreed to release some hostages. The negotiators believed that continuing dialogue offered a realistic chance of peaceful resolution. The siege had drawn the attention of the world's security services. Every major intelligence agency was watching. Every major military power was observing how the British authorities would handle the situation. The SAS, the Special Air Service of the British Army, had been placed on standby from the very beginning. They were preparing contingencies, rehearsing entry points, studying layouts, and waiting. While negotiators worked the phones, the SAS was studying floor plans of the embassy, identifying likely positions where gunmen would place themselves, calculating approach routes, and establishing positions from which an assault could be launched. The men who would carry out any assault were among the most highly trained soldiers in the world, but even their training couldn't account for the specific pressure they would face when the clock ran out. Each man in the assault team had trained for months to be able to perform under extreme pressure, but actually executing that training with lives depending on the outcome was fundamentally different from rehearsals. The commanders and the soldiers alike understood one thing with absolute certainty. If this came to a tactical resolution, the margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. There could be no hesitations. There could be no mistakes. Once the order was given, the operation would unfold at a speed that no negotiation could stop. The window for changing course or adapting the plan would essentially close. The gunmen were becoming increasingly frustrated with the pace of negotiations. They had set deadlines. They had threatened to execute hostages. The initial deadline came and went without resolution. Then another. Each time, the negotiators managed to convince the gunmen to extend the deadline, to allow more time for their demands to be addressed. But as deadlines passed and nothing tangible was achieved, the psychological pressure on the gunmen increased. They began to understand that their demands were not being met, that time was working against them, and that their situation was not improving. They had shot and killed one of the hostages on the second day of the siege, a British diplomat named Abbas Lavasani. His death had shocked the world and signaled that the gunmen were willing to kill. Lavasani had been shot in front of other hostages, a deliberate demonstration of the gunmen's willingness to use lethal force to show they were serious. They had proven their willingness to use lethal force. The negotiations had been strained ever since. Each deadline that the gunmen set, the negotiators had managed to push past, buying more time, but they all knew it couldn't last forever. The psychological dynamic inside the building was degrading. The gunmen had made a move designed to demonstrate their seriousness, and that move had had consequences, but British negotiators were still not capitulating. The gunmen were becoming increasingly trapped in their own logic. The gunmen were under pressure themselves, trapped inside the embassy with no clear way out, facing the knowledge that their situation was untenable. The authorities were not going to grant them safe passage. The Iranian government was not going to release prisoners because a British negotiator was on the phone asking them to do so. Their leverage was the hostages, but their leverage was diminishing. They had already executed one person, and that had not produced results. They had to know that British forces were outside, watching, waiting, and planning to come in. They had to understand that they were going to either surrender or die. As the fifth day of the siege wore on, the gunmen issued what appeared to be their final ultimatum. They demanded that an ambassador, a specific diplomatic representative, be brought to the building, or they would begin executing hostages. They set a deadline of 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The time was approaching midday. They gave the British authorities approximately 2 hours to meet their demand. The negotiations had come to their absolute breaking point. It wasn't clear that the deadline could be extended further. The gunmen seemed to have concluded that the time for negotiations had ended. They had issued multiple deadlines over 5 days, and each had passed without their demands being met. They understood that the British were buying time and had no intention of capitulating to their demands. They were ready to act. They had already killed once. They had threatened multiple times. Now they seemed determined to follow through. They stated clearly that they would begin executing hostages if their final demand was not met. And on the British side, the decision was being made that this could not continue. The Prime Minister's office, security officials, and military commanders were in consultation. The judgment was being made that negotiation had exhausted itself as an option. Waiting longer would not produce a different result. It would only give the gunmen more time to carry out their threats. If the hostages were to be saved, the only option now was immediate tactical intervention. The SAS would be given the order to assault the building, and they would have to move fast enough to prevent the gunmen from executing the hostages they had threatened to kill. The SAS commander on the ground, Colonel Michael Rose, was faced with an impossible calculation. Rose was an experienced officer who had commanded operations in multiple theaters. He had the authority to make the decision about whether to assault the building. The decision rested with him. Taking the embassy by force meant running through a building searching for gunmen and hostages in a situation of complete chaos and extreme danger. The building was a complex structure with multiple floors, multiple rooms, corridors, and blind corners where a gunman could be waiting. The gunmen would have every advantage of position and preparation. They had spent 5 days in the building. They knew the layout. They had prepared defensive positions. They had the hostages in specific locations that they controlled. The hostages would be scattered throughout the building, possibly in rooms with their captors, possibly in visible proximity to explosives. The gunmen had mentioned explosives. Whether or not explosives were actually present, the possibility had to be taken seriously. Any miscalculation, any delay, any failure to move with absolute speed and decisiveness could result in the deaths of the very people they were trying to save. A gunman, seeing assault teams moving in, could in desperation shoot a hostage. A nervous gunman could execute multiple hostages before he was neutralized. The window of vulnerability was measured in seconds. The commander had to weigh the statistical likelihood that negotiation could work against the statistical likelihood that an assault would succeed. He had to consider the psychological state of the gunmen. They had already killed, they had made threats, their demands had not been met. The probability of them executing additional hostages seemed high. Against that had to be weighed the risks of an assault. Assaults were dangerous. Things could go wrong. Hostages could be caught in crossfire. An assault could precipitate exactly the violence they were trying to prevent. He had to make that calculation while knowing that if he ordered the assault and it went wrong, it would be his decision that led to deaths. He would be responsible. History would record his failure. And if he didn't order the assault and the gunmen executed hostages, it would also be his decision. The responsibility for those deaths would also rest with him. Either way, deaths were possible. The only question was, which course of action reduced the probability of those deaths? According to accounts of the siege, Colonel Rose decided that negotiation had reached its limit. The gunmen had shown a willingness to kill. They had proven that they would execute hostages if their demands weren't met. The deadline they had set was approaching with no possibility of extending it further. Rose made his decision. He would order the assault. The only remaining option was to assault the building before the deadline was reached, before the gunmen could execute anyone else. The decision was made. The order would be given for the SAS to conduct an immediate tactical entry and neutralize the gunmen. But there was a problem. The assault had to be conducted at speed. The entire operation had to be fast enough that the gunmen inside wouldn't have time to execute hostages in response to the assault beginning. The psychological response of a gunman who suddenly hears explosions and sees armed soldiers breaching the building might be to kill a hostage. If the assault teams were slow, that hostage would die. If they were fast enough to reach the gunman before the gunman could react, the hostage could be saved. The commander calculated that if the building could be cleared and the gunmen neutralized in under a minute, the hostages inside would be protected. 1 minute. 60 seconds. The entire operation compressed into that window. If it took longer, there was a real risk that frightened, desperate gunmen would kill hostages. A gunman in a state of panic or desperation might shoot multiple times before being stopped. Every second mattered. Rose conveyed this to the assault teams. They would have not 1 minute, but 40 seconds to make the initial breaches and neutralize the primary threat. It was an extraordinarily demanding standard, but it was what the situation required. The teams had been prepared. They had trained repeatedly on similar building layouts. They had studied the embassy floor plans obsessively. The SAS had constructed a detailed replica of the relevant sections of the building in their training facility and had rehearsed the assault dozens of times. They knew where the gunmen were believed to be. Intelligence reports and negotiator communications had provided information about the gunmen's positions. They knew approximately where the hostages were being held. The gunmen had not hidden the hostages. In some cases, they had allowed negotiators to speak with the hostages. The locations were known or could be reasonably inferred. But studying a floor plan and actually clearing a building while searching for armed gunmen was fundamentally different. The teams would have to move faster and more decisively than they typically would. Normally, assault teams would move at a pace that allowed for careful observation of each corner, each room, each potential hiding place. In this case, speed was the priority. Moving slowly would give the gunmen time to act. The teams would have to breach simultaneously from multiple entry points to prevent the gunmen from concentrating their forces or executing hostages in response. If the assault came from only one direction, gunmen could move to defend that approach and could potentially reach hostages and execute them before the assault teams could reach them. Multiple simultaneous breaches would overwhelm the gunmen's ability to respond. They would face threats from multiple directions simultaneously. They would be forced to choose which threat to respond to, and while they were dealing with one assault team, other assault teams would be reaching hostages. They would have to move through confined spaces, around corners, through doorways where a gunman could be waiting on the other side. The danger was constant and extreme. Every doorway was a potential ambush point. The assault would begin with a breach. Explosive charges would blow open windows and doors simultaneously at multiple entry points. The charges were calculated carefully. They had to be strong enough to blow open reinforced doors and windows, but not so strong that they caused unnecessary damage or injury to nearby hostages. Stun grenades would be thrown to disorient the gunmen and confuse any hostages temporarily, so they would know to get down and stay down. The grenades would produce loud noise and bright light, designed to overwhelm the senses and prevent clear thought or action. Anyone who heard and saw the grenades would understand that a tactical operation was underway and would instinctively take cover. Then the assault teams would pour in, each man moving with absolute speed through a memorized clearing sequence. Every team member knew exactly where he was supposed to go, what he was supposed to do when he got there, and how he was supposed to respond if he encountered a gunman or a hostage. The first team would go in through windows on the upper floors, moving down through the building, systematically clearing each room. Another team would breach from another direction, working in coordination with the first team to ensure that the building was cleared systematically and that gunmen could not concentrate their forces or escape. The rear of the building would be covered by sharpshooters in case gunmen tried to escape through back windows. These sharpshooters would have authority to engage any gunman that appeared in their field of fire. Every available angle was being covered. Every contingency was being planned, but the one thing that couldn't be fully controlled was time. Training and planning could only go so far. When the assault actually began, circumstances would dictate what happened next. Colonel Rose gave his teams one specific instruction as they prepared to assault the building. According to sources and accounts from those who were involved, the commander told his teams that they would have 40 seconds to clear the building, to find and neutralize all gunmen, and to secure the hostages. 40 seconds. That number has become perhaps the most famous detail from the entire operation. The idea that a highly trained military unit would be given less than a minute to clear a multi-story embassy building, to identify and neutralize the enemy, and to save hostages seems almost impossibly difficult. But that was the calculation the commander had made. That was what he believed was necessary to prevent the execution of hostages. 40 seconds. It wasn't that the assault was expected to be completely finished in 40 seconds. The actual operation would take longer. But it was that the initial breach and clearing of the areas where the gunmen were known to be had to happen that fast. It was a specific instruction about tempo and urgency. The 40-second window was the critical window. It was the amount of time that the assault teams had to move into the building, locate the gunmen, and neutralize them before the gunmen could respond by executing hostages. Rose was telling his teams not that they had 40 seconds to save the day, but that they had 40 seconds to create the conditions under which hostages would be protected. After 40 seconds, even if the assault teams had not completely cleared the building, they should have neutralized the immediate threat of execution. The hostages would be protected. The assault would then continue at a more deliberate pace to ensure that all threats were completely neutralized and the building was completely secured. The assault teams moved into position. The teams took up locations around the building. Personnel were positioned at windows, at doors, at potential breach points. Explosive charges were placed at entry points. Sharpshooters moved to their assigned positions. The specific timing of the assault was discussed. The teams would wait for final orders. Stun grenades were readied. Assault rifles were checked one final time. Magazines were counted. Ammunition loads were verified. Every detail of preparation was confirmed. At a certain signal, the assault would begin. Everyone understood that when it began, it would unfold at extreme speed, and there would be no opportunity to adjust or modify the plan. The hostages inside the embassy had no warning that rescue was about to arrive. The gunmen had issued their final ultimatum but had not revealed a specific moment when executions would begin. They only knew that they were being held at gunpoint, that one of their colleagues had already been murdered, that their captors were growing increasingly frustrated, and that time seemed to be running out. They didn't know that, outside, one of the world's most elite military units was about to try to save them. They didn't know that in a matter of moments their building would be filled with the sound of explosions and gunfire. They didn't know that everything they had experienced over 5 days of terror was about to reach its violent conclusion in a matter of seconds. Some hostages would later report that they had heard sounds that suggested something was happening outside, but they had no way of knowing that rescue was at hand. The assault began, the signal was given, Colonel Rose gave the order, the charges detonated simultaneously, windows and doors blew open across multiple points of the building, stun grenades exploded, disorienting everyone in the building. The sound and light were overwhelming. Assault teams moved in with weapons up, eyes sharp, scanning for threats. The first floor was cleared room by room. The assault teams moved with mechanical speed and precision, the result of months of training. A gunman appeared. He was engaged and neutralized. The teams moved up. They had begun their countdown to 40 seconds. They had to maintain their speed or the entire operation would be compromised. Another gunman was encountered. He was eliminated. The teams moved deeper into the building. The clock was ticking. Every second that passed was a second the gunman inside could be moving towards hostages. The assault teams knew this. They had trained for exactly this scenario. But training and reality, as always, were different. Training didn't have the adrenaline. Training didn't have the weight of knowing that lives depended on your performance. The assault team members were experiencing the reality of what they had trained for. The actual environment was similar to the training environment, but different. The sounds were real explosions, not simulated. The threats were actual gunmen, not training dummies. The hostages were actual people, not role players. Every decision made in the heat of the moment had immediate and real consequences. The assault teams moved through the embassy with astonishing speed. They cleared room after room. The teams had trained these specific room-clearing sequences dozens of times. The training had embedded the procedures into muscle memory. The assault team members moved into each room, identified threats and hostages, engaged threats, and moved on to the next room. They located clusters of hostages and moved them to secure areas away from the gunmen. Communication was minimal and direct. Hostages were identified through basic questioning or observation. Those who were clearly not gunmen were moved to safe areas. Some of the gunmen, panicked by the sudden violent assault they didn't see coming, tried to escape. Others were frozen by shock. Some tried to move towards hostages, attempting to use them as shields or leverage. Some tried to resist, returning fire at the assault teams. The assault team members, moving with the kind of controlled aggression and speed that only comes from months of preparation, engaged and neutralized each threat. The gunmen were outmatched in every way. They were outnumbered. They were surprised. They were assaulted from multiple directions simultaneously. They had no opportunity to organize an effective response. The sound inside the embassy was overwhelming. Gunfire, explosions, stun grenades, shouting, the chaos of a violent tactical operation unfolding in confined spaces. The assault was designed to be overwhelming precisely to prevent the gunmen from having time to think or to act. It was designed to break their will to resist and to secure the location before they could harm anyone. The gunmen, expecting to have time to negotiate or to escape, found themselves instead in the middle of a violent assault. They had no time to think. They had no time to execute their threats. They had only time to react, and reaction was not enough. As the 40 seconds elapsed or approached their conclusion, the teams reported that the embassy was being secured. The gunmen had been found and neutralized. The hostages were being collected and moved to secure areas. The assault had succeeded. It hadn't been perfect. No tactical operation in real conditions ever is, but it had achieved what mattered most. It had gotten to the gunmen faster than they could kill any more hostages. 5 of the 6 gunmen inside the building were killed during the assault. The 6th gunman was captured and would later be prosecuted for murder. 19 hostages were brought out alive. Some had minor injuries from the stun grenades or from debris from the explosions. One hostage, a member of the Iranian embassy staff, was seriously injured and was rushed to hospital. But the majority of the hostages were rescued intact and unharmed. The operation had been violent and it had been fast, but it had accomplished its core mission. In the immediate aftermath of the assault, the teams collected the injured and began the process of securing the scene. Paramedics moved in to assess the hostages who had been exposed to the explosions and the chaos. The 5 dead gunmen were laid out and documented. The captured gunman was secured. The hostages were moved out of the building, still in shock from what they had experienced, but alive. The assault had taken approximately 16 to 17 minutes in total, from the moment the first explosions occurred to the moment the last of the hostages was brought out of the building. The 40-second directive had actually referred to the initial clearing phase, not the entire operation. But that initial phase was the critical one. That was when the gunmen had to be located and neutralized before they could use their weapons against the hostages. And it had worked. The debrief of the operation occurred over the following days and weeks. The military command analyzed what had happened. They studied which decisions had worked and why. They examined the 40-second timeline and confirmed that it had been accurate, that it had been achievable, and that it had been necessary. The assault team members were interviewed about what they had seen and experienced. The tactical sequences were examined frame by frame. Every detail of the operation was scrutinized because it was immediately clear that this operation had been successful in a way that many in the world's military establishments had doubted was possible. Taking a building by force and saving the hostages. It had been done. It had been done cleanly. It had been done with remarkable speed and with minimal collateral damage. What the operation revealed about SAS hostage rescue doctrine was profound. It showed that speed was an essential element of the rescue formula. It wasn't enough to be skilled. You had to be fast. You had to move so quickly that the hostage takers didn't have time to react. You had to hit them so hard and so suddenly that their ability to harm the hostages was taken away before they could exercise it. The 40-second timeline became a standard in military and police tactical training around the world. Other nations' special forces units studied the Iranian embassy siege with intense interest. What had the SAS done? How had they done it? What could be learned? The answer was that they had accepted the psychological pressure of an extremely tight timeline, and they had executed a plan with discipline and speed that other units aspired to achieve. They had made the calculation that speed and aggression, executed with precision, was more likely to save hostages than any amount of cautious, measured, tactical approach. The decision-making process, under extreme time pressure that Colonel Rose had demonstrated, also became a model for how commanders should think about hostage crises. The calculus was simple. Negotiation was valuable and should be the first option, but negotiation had limits. If the hostage taker had demonstrated willingness to kill, if deadlines were approaching, if there was no movement toward a solution, then waiting became more dangerous than acting. The act of waiting risked the loss of more hostages. The act of waiting risked giving the hostage taker more time to become increasingly desperate and less rational. Sometimes, the commander had concluded, the lesser risk was a swift, tactical intervention, no matter how dangerous that seemed. This thinking would influence how similar situations were handled around the world for decades afterward. The individual hostages who were rescued from the embassy experienced trauma that would stay with them. Some had been held at gunpoint. Some had heard the gunshot that killed Abbas Lavasani. Some had heard the assault beginning and had no way of knowing whether the people coming through the building were rescuers or additional threats. In the chaos of the breach, with stun grenades exploding and assault rifle fire echoing through the corridors, the psychological impact was severe. Hostages have reported decades later that certain sounds still trigger memories of that day, but they were alive. They had been saved, and that was what had mattered at the moment the order was given. The broader lessons from the Iranian embassy siege extended well beyond the immediate tactical success. The operation demonstrated that, in a hostage crisis, the threat level could shift suddenly from a situation that seemed manageable through negotiation to a situation where immediate force was the only option. It showed that when that threshold was crossed, the response had to be immediate and overwhelming. It showed that preparation and training could enable soldiers to perform at levels that seemed superhuman to outside observers. 40 seconds to clear an entire building, eliminate an armed threat, and save hostages. It shouldn't have been possible, but it was. And the reason it was possible was that men had trained for months to be able to do exactly that. The 40-second timeline also revealed something about the psychology of command. Colonel Rose had to make a decision knowing that if he was wrong, hostages would die. If he ordered the assault too early, he might be killing people unnecessarily when negotiation could have succeeded. If he ordered it too late or not at all, he would be allowing a murderous hostage-taker to choose who would live and who would die. He had to make that decision while being aware that the gunmen had already killed once. He had to make it while being aware that the gunmen were becoming increasingly unstable, and he had to make it fast, because the window for action was closing. The psychological pressure of that decision-making was immense, and yet it had to be made clearly and decisively. That ability to think clearly and decisively under extreme pressure became another lesson from the siege. A commander who hesitated would create hesitation in his teams. A commander who was unclear about his intent would create confusion in his teams. A commander who was confident in his decision would create confidence in his teams. And that confidence, that clarity of intent, that decisiveness, had been essential to achieving the 40-second timeline. In the years after the Iranian embassy siege, the SAS's reputation was transformed. Before the siege, the regiment was respected but not widely known outside military circles. After the siege, they became legendary. They became the standard by which all other hostage rescue units measured themselves. The operation was studied in military academies around the world. It was taught in police tactical schools. The 40-second timeline became a standard metric of what was achievable when preparation, skill, and speed were combined. The decision to assault, rather than to wait, became a model for commanders facing similar decisions. The entire approach to hostage rescue was influenced by what happened in that London embassy building on May 5, 1980. For the gunman who had survived the assault, the outcome was grim. The captured gunman was prosecuted for murder in connection with the death of Abbas Lavasani and for other offenses. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The 5 gunmen who were killed during the assault had made a calculation that had cost them their lives. They had believed that holding hostages at gunpoint would give them leverage. They had believed that executing a hostage would demonstrate their seriousness. They had not anticipated the speed and the violence with which the response would come. They had not understood that their actions had already crossed a threshold in the minds of the British authorities, a threshold after which negotiation was no longer the primary strategy. The SAS had been released, and in 40 seconds the situation was over. The operation also revealed something about the resilience and the capability of the hostages themselves. Some of the hostages had been held in terrifying conditions. One hostage, an Iranian chargé d'affaires, had been subjected to threats and abuse. The hostages had been forced to remain silent and still while their captors debated their fate. The death of Abbas Lavasani had been carried out in front of the other hostages, designed to terrorize them and to demonstrate the gunman's willingness to kill. And yet, when the assault came, the hostages had the presence of mind to follow the instructions they had received from their captors about getting down and staying low. They understood that the sounds of explosions and gunfire meant that rescue might be coming. Several of the hostages reported later that they had hoped against hope that it might be the authorities coming to save them, and when the assault teams began moving them out of the building, that hope had been confirmed. The Iranian embassy siege became a watershed moment in military and police tactics worldwide. It showed that complex, dangerous operations could be executed at a speed and with a precision that had previously seemed impossible. It showed that preparation and training could enable ordinary soldiers to do extraordinary things. It showed that command decisions made under extreme pressure, when made clearly and decisively, could lead to the best possible outcomes in genuinely dire situations. And it showed that sometimes the lesser risk was to act decisively and fast rather than to wait and negotiate. The 40-second timeline became a byword for tactical excellence. The SAS became the world's elite hostage rescue unit, and the lessons learned in that single operation would influence security policy and tactical training around the world for decades to come. The memories of those who were in the building that day would remain with them forever. The hostages would carry the trauma of captivity and violence. The assault team members would carry the memory of executing one of the most important tactical operations of their careers. Colonel Rose and the commanders involved would carry the knowledge that they had made the right decision at a moment when the wrong decision would have cost lives. And the world would carry the knowledge that when preparation, training, speed, and decisive command converged, it was possible to achieve outcomes that seemed impossible. In 40 seconds, a siege had been ended. In 40 seconds, a doctrine of hostage rescue had been established. In 40 seconds, the SAS had earned a legend that has not diminished in the nearly 40 years since that day.